This program is rated PG. It contains themes and scenes which may not be suitable for very young audiences. Parental guidance is advised.
Be advised that the views and opinions of the hosts and guests do not reflect those of the station.
It's been a week of turmoil all over the world and terrorism attacks in Europe and in other parts of the world, including Asia. And the Philippines has not been spared, yet we still have the very important occasion to celebrate this week of Independence Day. And of course, one of the continuing issues of the Week of Independence is the question of the independent foreign policy. So some people in this segment of ours, People and Places, we will feature now discussing the question of the independence of this country and in particular its foreign policy, independence in its foreign policy. Here is an assessment made by two of our veteran and esteemed diplomats, retired both of them, who have served the government and the country for decades. This is Ambassador Alberto Encomienda and Ambassador Romero. We had this media forum at the Kamuning Bakery Cafe last June 14, I think, and the subject matter was the independent foreign policy of the country and how is Duterte's policy faring in the current situation. So the first we will roll is the commentary from Ambassador Alberto Encomienda.
Talking about, again, independent foreign policy, as Ambassador Romero said, no less than former President Ramos said that in this day and time, there cannot be independent foreign policy simply because of the way the nations interact with each other. That line has been echoed by Undersecretary Baha, formerly of the Department of Foreign Affairs, and even came out in an article by the editor of Star, Pamintuan, Ami Pamintuan, that indeed there cannot be an independent foreign policy because of the way nations are interacting at this time. Now, my take on that is this. Independent foreign policy, if I may go back to what I said, is in the Constitution. I would rather use that term. Number two, to the essence of an independent foreign policy, it cannot be interdependent with those of other countries simply because foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy, and therefore, each country out of the almost 200 nations in the world has its own national interest to pursue. So just following that line, we have our national interest that cannot be the same as that of the United States, as that of China, as that of India, as that of Vietnam, or even Malaysia. So for me, there's no occasion to talk about interdependent foreign policy because a state must always pursue its own vital national interests through its foreign relations. I hope I've made myself clear on that. Now, the second point really is, for me also, again, Ambassador Romero did not discuss this approach, but really, for myself, talking about independent foreign policy for the Philippines, there is that question of whether we are indeed independent, we are pursuing independent foreign policy, simply because we have a mutual defense treaty with the United States. Now, again, I talk more on the academic side of international relations. Entering into treaty relations or even defense relations through a treaty does not compromise independent foreign policy. In fact, if you enter into an alliance with other countries, whether through treaties or through temporary arrangements, say exigencies of international relations, that is an exercise of sovereignty. Now, but my problem with the Mutual Defense Treaty is, number one, it has already lapsed by itself. Why? Because you look at the preamble of the Mutual Defense Treaty. I think it's about preambular paragraph 4. It says there that the Mutual Defense Treaty will exists only until the collective defense arrangements under the UN Charter, especially on Chapter 8 and regional arrangements, has come into force. Well, let me put it this way. Try to make it clearer. When the world adopted the United Nations Charter, it sort of imposed the collective defense arrangement for any security issue in the world. And that is under Chapter 7 of the Charter. You can read it for yourself. But on the other hand, Chapter 8 says regional arrangements can also exist for security purposes. Now, but according to the United Nations Charter, if you have a regional security arrangement, once that regional security arrangement can work only up to the time that the case is brought up to the Security Council of the United Nations. The regional arrangement cannot settle it by themselves without bringing it to the Security Council. Now, going back to the Mutual Defense Treaty, part of that was explained already by Ambassador Romero. The problem with the Mutual Defense Treaty is, number one, it is conditional. It says that it will be in existence only until the mechanisms of the UN, especially regional arrangements, come into force. Now, has that condition that condition has not happened. What the U.S. tried to do, taking up from what Ambassador Romero said, was to bastardize Chapter 8 of the United Nations by establishing regional arrangements all over the world with the United States at the fulcrum. So it had NATO, fine, NATO is still in existence. It had CENTOS, the Central Treaty Organization with the Latin Americans. It was born, but it did not live too long. It had the CITO, in which Philippines is part of. CITO is a distant memory, okay? Okay, ANSUS, there's still some fragments there like ANSUS, but again, that is not the concept under the UN. So, if you ask me, the Mutual Defense Treaty is already lapsed.
Okay, that was Ambassador Alberto Encomienda, former ambassador of the Philippines to Singapore, to Malaysia, and I think to Greece, yes. And he is one of the few maritime experts in the country, and he was part of the Philippine team as a young diplomat, aiding our UNCLOS negotiating team led by the late Senator Arturo Tolentino. And similarly, our next interview or the next discussion is Ambassador Joe Romero, who was ambassador to the Vatican and held many posts in government through many administrations. And we had interview with him on his 83rd birthday. He is president of the Philippine Council for Foreign Relations, and he also focused on the Mutual Defense Treaty as a major issue in the question of Philippine independence and the Philippine independent foreign policy. This Mutual Defense Treaty as a continuing problem, because this has been the basis also for the establishment of the EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which allowed and allows the presence of U.S. Military in Philippine military bases. So let's listen to Ambassador Joe Romero.
Can we have an independent foreign policy with a mutual defense agreement with another country? Because that mutual defense agreement conditions the movement or the policies of the partner. So it cannot be independent. Parang mag-asawa yan. Mutual defense agreement, which says that if somebody will bomb Hawaii, which is part of the U.S. territorial thing, the Philippines is duty-bound to support the Americans against a third party. Now, who's the third party? It could be anybody, Japan, China, whoever. So, can we say that, no, I am not going to do it? We are bound by the Mutual Defense Agreement in the same way that the Americans, Kono, are bound to defend us if we are attacked by a third country. But they somehow managed to get out of the West China Sea. They said, no, hindi kasama yan sa territorial thing, and so it does not fall under the Mutual Defense Agreement. So my question then is, can you have an independent foreign policy under conditions of where you have a mutual defense agreement with a superpower? You know that mutual defense agreement was part of the grand strategy of the United States to control the Asia-Pacific territory. So they have about 500 bases there to contain China, bases in Taiwan, in Okinawa, and the Philippines is the most forward position of that security strategy. And that forward position made it easy for the United States to extend its hard power using Clark. Clark is the home base of the biggest air hub of the U.S. outside of the U.S. And Subic is the home of the biggest armada in the world, the Sixth Fleet. So the Americans use these facilities to extend its hard power, to take on enemies. In the 60s, it was Vietnam. The bombing raids in Vietnam and all of the things were staged from Clark. So we have been really part of the U.S. security arrangements. So you can say, well, we have an independent foreign policy. Yes, but we have an agreement with the U.S. to support their foreign policy. So you cannot have us supporting U.S. foreign policy and still be independent of U.S. foreign policy. So that is the question now. Before
the Philippine government. Are we going to have an independent foreign policy?